2 years ago, after the birth of our third son, we realized that we did not have enough room for everybody in our vehicle, plus all this stuff that goes with having a baby, right? Like, they're small people, but they need a lot of equipment. So we went car shopping. And we had not been car shopping for a number of years, so this was kind of an old, new experience for us. And we ended up with a minivan, which I know minivans evoke some strong emotions for some people, right? Like, especially guys. There's some people that just would not be caught dead in a minivan. But I like our minivan, right? It works really well for us. You can pack a bunch of kids and some of their friends back there, so I like it. But, what we discovered is that you get behind the wheel of this newer vehicle, something newer than what we had, and the guy, the salesman, he starts showing you everything that it can do, all those different features. So you press this button and it turns on the right lane change camera, and you press this and it changes the temperature controls in the rear, and you can warm up your seats, and you can fold these seats under and whatever, right? There's all these different things that you can do, and there's more than what we were used to. Of course, there's a lot more sophisticated vehicles out there. Some of them even have autopilots and that sort of thing, but they show you this stuff. It's all the bells and whistles, right? But here's the thing. Even with all the bells and whistles, in the end, a car is a car. There is a steering wheel, there's a brake and a gas pedal, there's a shift to put it in drive or into reverse or neutral. A car is a car when you get right down to it. It's the basics that matter most. Is it dependable? Is it efficient? Does it transport your family safely? And I'm thinking about this during this new year because we're spending some time talking about the vision of the church. And I think about our life together as the church. It's a little bit like going out to buy a car. So hear me out on this. There's a lot of different things that we do together as the church. And there can be a lot of things that we are a part of, programs that we participate in, service projects that we undertake. And they can all be great things, all the bells and whistles of doing church together. But at heart is something very straightforward, in some ways simple. We are called to love Jesus and to love one another. That's at the heart of what it means to do church. And this year, as we think about our vision, as we think about our mission, I think we've got to get back to the basics, that we love Jesus and love one another. I just really love this passage in the Gospel of John. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he says that he's the vine, they're the branches, they're growing out of him. He says that their life comes from him. He says without him they can do nothing. And it's all about remaining in Jesus' love. And I like that word. Sometimes it's translated as remain, but I like it when it's translated abide. It's a great Bible word. Abide in Jesus' love. That's what we're called to do. We abide in Jesus' love. And that's what he says in verse 9, as the Father has loved you, loved me, so I have loved you. Now abide in my love. He says that if we obey his commands, we remain or abide in his love. And he says in verse 12, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. He says there's no greater love than laying down one's life for one's friends. We're his friends if we do what he commands. And what does he command? Verse 17, love each other. Now the image is one of the love of the Father pouring through Jesus and becoming love for the world. The image is loving Jesus and loving one another. And I think that's at the core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We have a heart for Jesus. We have a heart for one another. And sometimes I think we can forget what following Jesus means. In one way, there's a lot that goes into it, right? We follow Jesus by reading and studying the gospel so that we can see who he is and how he lives and how we conform our lives to his. We follow Jesus by gathering together as a church to worship him. The church is the body of Christ. And so if we want to connect to Christ, then we go to church. We come to his table. We share his body and his blood. We spend time in prayer. We talk to him. We listen to him. We seek to follow him in our day-to-day lives. What would Jesus do? Whatever we think that would be in our shoes, we try to live that out. Those are some of the things that we do as individuals to follow Jesus. And as a church, we have things that we do too, right? We have programs like Sunday school or our Wednesday night Mount Ridge Youth Ministries that we host, or youth group. We do things like printing bulletins and preparing worship for Sunday. They write sermons. We have these amazing musicians who come together, they practice their songs, they pick them out with care. Worship team thinks about themes and how we want to direct worship throughout the year. The trustees keep the facilities running. CDT plans education and activities. Deacons connect with people in need. Mission team looks at ways to reach out. There are lots of things we do, lots of meetings, and lots of work that happens. But as important as all of those things are, none of them by itself is the heart of what we do as the church or who we are as followers of Jesus. At heart, everything that we do is about love for Jesus and love for one another. We maintain this beautiful church building so that we can come together to worship Jesus and learn about him without having to be concerned about the weather. We plan activities and recruit Sunday school teachers so that we can grow in what it means to love Jesus and one another. We reach out in the community. We seek to connect people to his experience of love and being transformed in him. But all of it, at its heart, all those bells and whistles, those are really about loving Jesus and loving one another. And sometimes I think we have to be reminded of this. It's a little bit like a garden, right? It's a little bit like growing cucumbers on a trellis. I don't know if you've ever grown your cucumbers on a trellis. My brother does vegetable farming in Illinois. He's got some greenhouses lined with trellises. So if you want to imagine what these look like, imagine some 2x4s that are kind of built into a structure that run the length. There's some supports along the way. They run the length of the greenhouse, and there's a special kind of a netting that is affixed to those 2x4s all the way down. He plants cucumbers on the ground, and he trains them up along those trellises. And here's a picture so you can kind of get the idea. He runs his irrigation hoses along the ground so that each plant gets just the right amount of water, and he can inject fertilizer through the irrigation system. And the end result is that at the end of the summer, it's like a jungle in there, right? You just about need a machete to get through the greenhouse. And the vines have twined their way nearly all the way up to the ceiling. Think about this for a moment. The greenhouse, the irrigation tubes, the trellises, all the work that goes into it, think about what all that is for. It's for growing cucumbers. You do everything in there because you want cucumbers and lots of them. And it's kind of like that with the church, right? All of our structures and our building and our committees and the work that we pour into making it all run, all of that is because of Jesus. It's because we love him and we want to share our lives with him. It's because we want to grow in knowledge of him. It's because we want to love one another in his love. Everything is the trellis for loving Jesus and loving one another, and that is the fruit. And it means a couple of things. All of our structure, all the ways that we do things, all our traditions and our musical preferences, that's the trellis for loving Jesus and one another. And if we find that some of the components of the trellis are no longer working or are making our core mission difficult to carry out, then that means we have to think about changing some things. You go into your greenhouse, if you don't see any cucumbers, you got to ask yourself, why not? Right? You change the irrigation tubes, or you change the skin on the greenhouse, or you check to see what's not working. You change up the trellis system. Because the trellis exists for the sake of the cucumbers and not vice versa. The trellis can change, but the core mission that we have as a church always stays the same. And this is what I've been thinking about over the last couple of months. This is where my mind kind of goes. I look at our church, and I think to myself that we have had a lot of great years together. We've been able to reach out in the community. We have served together. We have connected people to the gospel. We've prayed our hearts out. We have sang praises to God. We've studied the word together. We've been faithful. In a lot of ways, it's been good. But I ask myself, is it still working? Is our current structure, are our current ways of doing things allowing us to bear the fruit that God calls us to bear? Are we reaching out effectively? Are we making it comfortable for people who don't come from a Mennonite background, who have no idea what Veronica is, and who would never think to take black beans and wrap them in pastry dough and put cream over them and eat them as a dessert. People would never think to do that. Is it comfortable for them to join us and participate in our life? Are we engaging children and youth in a substantive way? I think in some ways the answer to that is no. I feel like the cucumber farmer who's kind of looking at the greenhouse and saying, this is good soil. We should have more cucumbers. What do we need to do differently? What's the trellis and what's the fruit? Are we living into the purpose that God has given us, or are we just trying to keep things running? Are we just doing things the way that we've mostly done them before to just survive? I don't know how you feel about change. I suppose that everybody has a different tolerance level for change. In some ways, I like my routines. In other ways, I kind of get excited about things, about thinking about how we can do things differently. I get excited when we can reach new people, about, we think about how we can grow. When I think about possibilities, I sort of get excited about change. But I don't know where you're at. I believe that 2021 is going to be a year of change. I think it's going to be a year where we have to be courageous, a year to be bold. But I get that change is hard, that change involves risk, that there are no guarantees. The courageous mouse who goes first, who rushes in, doesn't get the cheese. And I think it's time, though, to think about what are we doing and how do we do it better. I think it's time to get back to the basics, Jesus and one another. And it feels to me like COVID really revealed and accelerated some of the challenges that we face as a congregation. Many of our members are older. A number of them have moved to retirement communities or passed on to glory. And suddenly here we are, maybe beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel of this whole COVID thing. And I really think that this is the moment where we have to take stock and ask, what is our purpose? What is our mission? So listen to this. Our mission as the church is not to survive. It's not just to be here. It's not just to preserve what was. We are a church, not a museum. And the mission of the church is not to survive. It's to thrive with the vibrancy that comes from living out the mission that God has given us. Who cares about surviving? There's tons of churches in our little town. What's one more or one less? I'm kind of feeling like it's vibrancy or bust for us right now. And it seems to me that what matters is whether we are thriving in God's mission. Are we responding to God's call? Are we reaching the lost? And it's really a basic tenet of the Christian faith that without Jesus, we're lost. We will not live a truly rich and full life without Jesus. We will not go to heaven without Jesus. And I hope you know that. We don't go to heaven because we're such nice people. The only way to spend eternity with God is to place our faith in Jesus. I was talking to a pastor the other day who led his congregation in deeply rural eastern Kansas to experience tremendous growth. He said that one of the things that was key for them to going from being a church of 17 old people to a congregation with 500 people gathered in multiple locations with an active plan to plant churches in new communities. One of the things that kickstarted that was a conviction that the lost in their community needed to be reached. Do we believe that people are lost? Do we believe that those people exist in our community? Because I'm telling you, they do. You have neighbors who don't know Jesus, and they're lost. Are we a church that is oriented outward, that makes our central care and concern reaching the lost? Here's where I think we're at. I think it's time to recalibrate. I think it's time to rethink things. It's time to ask if our name and our worship style and our seating arrangements and our children's programs are working as a trellis for us to reach the lost in our community or not. I think it's time now to get back to the basics and to rethink things from the ground up. Now, what would this look like? I've got some concrete proposals that I've kind of been kicking around with some of our leadership, but here's the gist of it. I think if we get back to basics with Jesus, we'll see a renewed commitment to prayer in our congregation. We'll want to pray together. We'll find times to gather to pray in Jesus' name. We'll be hungry to pray together. And then we'll also be hungry for the scriptures. And we'll look for opportunities to learn more about who Jesus is and what Jesus is calling us to become, we'll grow as people of mercy, so that we're living out the works of mercy in our daily lives. We'll have a burden for the lost who do not know Jesus. I think it's really a revival of life in Jesus. It's getting re-centered in him. Now, it's not like it's starting from zero. I know we love Jesus here, right? This is why I love this church. I love Jesus, and I see you loving Jesus, and I want new people to come and to share that love for Jesus. But I think that the Christian life is always supposed to be a life of growth, where we are becoming more and more like him, where we're finding ourselves more deeply rooted in Jesus each day, so that we never really get to the end of that. There's always more room to grow. We never really arrive. I think about the Apostle Paul. He said in Romans 12, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds." And what he was getting at was not just something that he believed in his head, it was something that he actively lived out. Paul was always coming to know Jesus more and more. His life with Jesus was really a process of growth and discovery. And I think you see this especially when you watch across the course of his letters how Paul processes the way that pain and suffering fit into the Christian walk. So in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul famously says that he was experiencing a thorn in his flesh, and he asked God to take that thorn from him, whatever that was. He said he asked God 3 times, take that thorn away, but instead God responded to him, "My grace is sufficient to you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Paul's reporting on his growth right there with that statement. He's saying that he came to understand something more deeply about Jesus through his lived experience, and then to grow out of that. He came to love Jesus even more in places of suffering. That was his growth. He never got to the end. And I think we can grow in our love for one another as well. In so many ways, this congregation really excels at loving one another. I have seen it. You've been there for each other in some really tough and complicated places. You've been there for me and my family in some hard places. It has not always been easy. We've shown up for each other. It's the obvious stuff like funerals, but it's also the times that not everybody hears about, and I've seen those. You really deserve some kind of an award. But I know how as a church we have reached out to people. We've been with them in times of deep, deep tragedy and hurt and confusion. I've seen you love on one another. It's a beautiful thing. But I think it's also something we can continue to grow in. I'm convinced that we can find ways to reach out to one another and to include one another in our lives. And I'm not just talking about inviting each other over to eat. That's a good thing to do, though it's kind of been hard in this last year. And it's still a little bit sketchy to invite people into your home. You kind of got to figure out what your risk level is. But I'm just talking about texts and phone calls and finding ways to connect. Even on Sunday morning, if you're at the front of the church, do you know who's at the back? I think it's a terrible tragedy when someone comes to our church for many different Sundays and somebody doesn't even know who they are, right? We want to get to meet people. I remember when I was a young student living in Boston, and I attended this little urban church, and I showed up on Sunday morning. I participated in worship. They'd have a hospitality table with some treats at the back, and I'd get some goodies and talk to people afterwards. But I wasn't planning to be a pastor or anything like that. I was just going to church, and I picked this church out of the phone book. If you remember what a phone book was, it's this big book, but has lists of numbers and things. Anyway, I picked it out of the phone book because it had the same name as the church that I attended when I was in college, and so when I went to grad school, I just went to the same church, same name. But part of what got me connected to this church, where I didn't know anybody, was because people were so kind to me and welcomed me. And I remember once one of the older members of the church died, and I did not know her well. I was just this student that came on Sunday morning, like I said, but the idea came to me that we're the church. This older woman had died, and I should go to her visitation, right? I'm like 22 years old, and I'm like, I should go to her visitation. And I didn't own a car. I just had a bicycle, and I had to ride way across the city out to one of the suburbs or something. And I walked in the funeral home, and I remember that it was the pastor and the widower standing by the casket and nobody else. And I walked in, this 22-year-old kid, And they were just kind of like dumbfounded by that. And I guess I was sort of surprised myself. But for some reason, it was just this thing that I felt like I had to do because I felt like, look, this is my church. I've been studying the New Testament, been trying to understand the life of Jesus and what it means to be the church. And this is what it means. It means showing up for each other. And so I showed up for them that time. And you see, showing up for one another, loving one another, laying down our lives for one another, that's not just in the huge stuff. That doesn't just mean when we need to give a kidney or something like that. I think that showing up for one another, and what Jesus was talking about when he said, greater love has no one than this, that he will lay down his life for his friends, I think he meant giving ourselves to each other in the simplest and most mundane ways. I think he meant giving time to one another. I think he meant giving space for one another to talk through what's going on in our lives. I think he meant giving concern for one another. I think he meant caring enough to want to know a person who's different than you, who's outside of your circle of comfort. And we're never going to be able to lay down our lives for our friends in a literal way if we're not able to lay down our lives in an hour, just lay down an hour of our lives to sit with someone and get to know them. And this goes beyond those who are already part of our church. Love for one another also takes the form of hospitality towards those outside the church. And hospitality is kind of one of those tricky words because a lot of times when we think about hospitality, we think about entertaining, like inviting someone over and having the house all in perfect order and kind of engaging in light chit-chat about the weather and sports. But Rosaria Butterfield, who is a writer who has really striven to take hospitality seriously and to practice it in her life, and with the life of her family, she says this: hospitality is about meeting the stranger and welcoming that stranger to become a neighbor. And she says that hospitality is really a form of mission. Says Butterfield, entertainment is about impressing people and keeping them at arm's length. Hospitality is about opening up your heart and your home just as you are and being willing to invite Jesus into the conversation. I want that for us. I don't think hospitality always has to mean inviting people into your homes. I know it's not the easiest right now. But do we have space for hospitality built into our lives where we can connect with people, where we can get to know them? Maybe it's in the park or in the post office or in the grocery store. I think it starts with just being open to talking to people. This is what I want for us. This is what I want for me. I want for us to get back to the basics of love for Jesus and love for one another. I think that's at the heart of us. And I think we need to get re-centered. Everything else we do, those are beautiful things. They're the bells and whistles. But loving Jesus, loving each other, that's the Christian life. The rest is just details. Amen.